Hello and welcome to Module 2. I appreciate your hard work during Module 1. The first module is always shortened by a couple of days since the course does not start until Monday and the module finishes up by Friday. But you have worked hard, done the reading, participated in the discussions, and for that I am grateful. I also want to thank you for your participation in the Truth and Lies activity that we did as part of the discussion forum in that module. That's always one of my favorite parts of the course. I love seeing the creative things that people come up with to introduce themselves and the ways in which people try to guess facts about their classmates who may be spread throughout the country. With this module, we're going to jump right into the biblical text itself, starting with Genesis 1 and 2, and then the second lecture that's posted with this module will take in the rest of the primeval history, as we call it, in Genesis 3 through 11. Let's begin with prayer. Dear God, we thank you today for the beauty of your world. Thank you for these biblical accounts of your creating activity and what they teach us about you. Thank you for your eternal existence, and most of all, thank you for creating us and then for redeeming us through your Son, Jesus Christ. Send your enlightening spirit to us as we study what you have revealed about yourself in these stories from the first part of Genesis. Through Christ our Lord, we pray. Amen. Okay, as we said, with this module, we're going to jump into Genesis itself. We're going to take a look at the first 12 chapters of the book. As we will eventually see, that is the first of 4 sections of Genesis, this section to which we give the name Primeval History. And so as we make our comments today and think about this material, there are really 2 main topics that I'm going to want to cover. Number 1 is something that we call Pentateuchal source criticism. In other words, we are going to use our study of Genesis 1 and 2 kind of as a way of getting ourselves into talking about who wrote the Pentateuch as a whole, who wrote Genesis through Deuteronomy, and what were those people's agendas as they were telling these stories. And then in the second part of my remarks today, we're going to go on and we're going to talk about the creation stories themselves as you have read them in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. First of all, however, I want to briefly outline the entire book of Genesis for you. Genesis is a little bit different than the other books because in Genesis we don't yet have an entire nation, and so the book in the first 11 chapters it is about God's creative activity with the cosmos, and then finally about God's life with the first 4 generations of his chosen people in chapters 11 through 50. And so, as we have said, the primeval history is that part of Genesis which begins in chapter 1:1 and goes through chapter 11, verse 26. After that, of course, we'll turn our attention to the very first person who was called by God and given a promise by God that he and his descendants would be God's people. And so chapters 11 through 25 are going to talk about Abraham and about his life and about his children, his relationship with God, and so forth. And so that group of stories is usually referred to as the Abraham cycle. From there, in chapters 25 through 36, we have what is called the Jacob cycle. Those stories primarily center around Abraham's grandson Jacob. The generation in between, which is occupied by Isaac, that doesn't really get its own cycle. The stories about Isaac are contained either in the Abraham cycle or in the Jacob cycle. And then finally, at the end of Genesis, the book is going to close with the Joseph story, the story about Joseph going down to Egypt, which is eventually going to find the Israelites down in Egypt as well. Okay, so then let's go look at the first item on our agenda for today, which is what we call Pentateuchal source criticism. And we're going to find out briefly that there are 2 different creation stories in chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis. The first one starts at the very beginning and goes right through the 3rd verse of chapter 2, and then starting in chapter 2, verse 4, and going on through the end of that chapter is going to be another account of creation. And so before we get into seeing how this relates to issues of source and the authorship, I want you to take just a few minutes to jot down in your notes, as I put it on the screen, all of the similarities and differences you notice between the 2 accounts. Okay, so again, we have got creation account number 1. in chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 3, and then chapter 2, beginning with verse 4, and the rest of that chapter is a second story about God creating. So please pause the video for a few moments, jot down all of the similarities and the differences that you notice between those two stories. Okay, thank you for participating in that exercise. There are all kinds of differences and similarities, and I certainly am not going to be able to replicate everything that you came up with, but just to hit some of the highlights that students often mention. In terms of similarities, you probably wrote that those stories are both about God's creation of the universe. In each story, God is the one who is the creator. Water is going to play an important role in both stories, and we will look at that a little bit. Both stories are going to mention plants, so the creation not just of human beings and animals in the earth, but even going down to the level of vegetation. Some of you perhaps pointed out that in both of these stories, human beings have some kind of a role in the creative process. And you probably noticed that as God creates human beings, both of those stories point to some kind of a connection between God and humans, perhaps in a sense of similarity, and we'll say a little bit more about what we mean. However, as you were going through this, you probably also noticed that there were a good number of differences between the first and the second story. For example, how many days did the process take? In the first story, it makes it evident that God did his creating on days 1 through 6, and then on the seventh day he rested, and so if you count the rest day, that's a full week, 7 days. The second story really doesn't say, does it? It doesn't really divide it by days. It doesn't ever have a transition from one day to the next, so by reading the second story, you could almost get the impression that everything there took place in the same day. The story is also different in terms of the order in which things were created, especially the animals and the man and the woman. So in the first story, the animals are the first thing created on day 6, and then male and female created together simultaneously, it seems to suggest, also on day 6 after the creation of the animals. However, in the second story, you'll note that first God is going to create the male, the man. Second, God is going to create animals because God wants to have somebody to keep the man company. And then after the animals, then God finally, out of the rib of the man, is going to create the woman. You'll notice also that these stories give different emphases as they talk about and describe God. I think it's fair to say that in the first story, God is portrayed in more what we call transcendent terms, whereas in the second story, God is portrayed more in immanent terms. And the immanence and the transcendence of God working together is an important part of even Christian theology today, and hopefully you have run into that or will soon run into it in your introductory theology course. We can say that in the second story, God is portrayed in much more anthropomorphic terms. In other words, he is portrayed as having a lot of the characteristics of human beings. He gets his hands down in the dirt, if you will, to create man, and he seems to be right there among them. On the other hand, in the first story, you get the impression that God is looking from a distance. And at the very least, you don't have God getting God's hands in all of this, but you simply have God creating by the power of his own word. The first story is more poetic in a sense. There's a lot of parallelism and repetition in that first creation story, which is typical of Hebrew poetry, versus the second story, where there's not as much of that. It is more of a narrative. And again, the second story, as Gerhard von Rad says, as you read it, you can almost smell the freshly plowed earth as you turn the page to Genesis chapter 2. Now, we're going to come back and pay more attention to the stories themselves in a few minutes. But first of all, let me start with talking a little bit about how these stories illustrate for us some of the issues that have been behind some of the discussions and debates concerning who wrote the Pentateuch and how it was written down. The reason I do this exercise is because it gives us a great illustration of some of the differences we see between two stories. And similar kinds of differences are going to continue to exist throughout the entire 5 books of the Pentateuch. For many years, the assumption was, and the tradition was, that Moses was the one who had written the Pentateuch, starting with the book of Genesis and going on through the end of the book of Deuteronomy. This was kind of the tradition that existed throughout ancient Judaism. And in fact, ancient Jews believed not only that Moses had written the Pentateuch, but also that in addition to doing that, he had also given them a series of what is often called oral law or oral Torah, laws that were passed down by word of mouth through the centuries. And so when we get to the time of Jesus, the Pharisees are believing that not only is the written Torah authoritative, but this oral Torah is authoritative as well. And a lot of that they believe was also handed down by Moses is going to find itself written in the Talmuds that the Jewish community is going to produce. However, as time went on, certain verses of the Old Testament and of the Pentateuch in particular began to raise questions about whether Moses had in fact written the entire Pentateuch or not. Okay? One of those was, for instance, that the Pentateuch describes Moses' death. People said, how could Moses write about his own death? Another passage that kind of raised question was the description of Moses in Numbers 11 as the most humble man on the face of the earth. Now, if Moses himself had written this book calling himself the most humble man on the face of the earth, wouldn't that kind of contradict exactly what he's trying to write? Also, people and theologians began to notice a few what we call seams or maybe inconsistencies in the text. For example, in Genesis 21, Ishmael is carried off to the wilderness and put under a tree by his mother as if he is an infant. But yet, if we go back and read the story of Ishmael from where it started, by the time we get here to chapter 21, he should be 13 years old. And so throughout the centuries of the church, people began to notice some of these differences and also some of the same differences that we saw in the creation story. The questions about the authorship then of the Pentateuch and questions about whether Moses really could have written it started to increase more once we hit the time of the Enlightenment, until they were finally brought together at the end of the 19th century by the great Old Testament scholar named Julius Wellhausen. And what Wellhausen did was kind of to bring together a lot of the questions and thoughts and opinions that people had been having and to form them into a coherent story about how the Pentateuch came to be. Okay, and so Wellhausen, of course, argued that the Pentateuch was not written by one person from beginning to end and not by Moses, but rather he suggests there are at least 4 major authors who have contributed stories to the Pentateuch, to the books of Genesis through Deuteronomy, and later on, all of these, through a process that was gradual and extended over centuries, all of these were brought together until we finally have the Pentateuch as we have it now. Okay, and so we're going to talk a little bit about who were some of the authors that Wellhausen identified, where did they live, and how did they contribute to the Pentateuch to bring it to the form that we have right now. Okay, so of the 4 writers of Pentateuchal material, the oldest one, Wellhausen thought, was somebody that he identified as the Yahwist, who is often called J for short. Okay, and the reason he is called the Yahwist is because this author uses the name Yahweh to describe God. This is another difference you probably noticed between the 2 creation stories. Only the second story in chapter 2 calls God Yahweh or Lord, as it is put in most English translations, whereas in the first story, God is always referred to only as God. Okay, so the first author of Pentateuchal material in his mind was the Yahwist or J. By the way, we call him J for short because in German, the word Yahweh begins with a J, and Wellhausen was a German. And so Wellhausen said that the Yahwist was probably the earliest writer of Pentateuchal material. Wellhausen dated him back to probably the period from 950 BC to 850 BC. So he may have started during the time of the Davidic or the Solomonic monarchy or shortly after. And I think that is roughly where Dr. Arnold is going to date him as well. Now, the Yahwist, J, Again, we're talking about the person who wrote the chapter 2 creation story. The Yahweh Wellhausen said is from the south. That he's from the kingdom of Judah. And the reason that seems likely is that a lot of the stories in the Pentateuch written by Jay that we think were written by him take place in southern locations. And in a lot of the later stories, especially about conflicts between the brothers, the heroes of Jay's stories are going to be southern tribes and people named after the southern tribes. In his theology, the Yahwist is generally going to support the monarchy, okay, but at the same time, he's going to criticize it. And once we get to chapters 3 and 4, we'll talk a little bit about how those stories might be intended as an implicit criticism of king and the kingship. Jay tends to talk about God in anthropomorphic terms to display God as having certain human-like qualities. And we already mentioned that that was the case in chapter 2 of Genesis. Finally, the Yahwist, or Jay, is going to have an understanding of humans as infected by pride in the attempt to be like God. Okay, for Jay, that is kind of the essential. That is kind of the essential sin. That is the essence of human sin, is pride and the attempt to be like God. However, Jay is also going to have the theme of blessing as an important part of it, and it's often going to portray people as being blessed by Yahweh. So let's just get on a list on the screen here, some of these items that we mentioned as belonging to Jay. Okay, and so Jay was the first source that Wellhausen is going to identify. The second source is going to be somebody who is going to be called the Elohist, or E. Okay, Elohist because he uses the name Elohim, which is simply the Hebrew term for God. Okay, and so for Elohim, we have Elohist, and therefore he is called E. We do not have the Elohist here in the first two stories of Genesis. In fact, the Elohist is the least well represented source that we have in the Pentateuch, and there's been some debate among scholars about whether E even ever existed as a separate source. If he did exist separately, it seems that fairly early on in the process, J and E, those two writings, were combined together into what is often called the Old Epic Narrative, and that's probably the form in which a lot of the ancient Israelites would have noted it. Okay, in terms of characteristics of the Elohist, first, if J was from the south, E is usually seen as being from the north. E probably wrote in the north about 100 years after the Yahwist did. So he's often dated maybe to the mid-9th century. As we said, he's going to refer to God as Elohim. In E, God is going to be more transcendent. Okay, in the J stories, for instance, when we're talking about Abraham, it is very common for God to speak directly to Abraham, or to appear right before Abraham, taking the form of a human almost. In E, we don't have that. In the stories that stem from E, perhaps the story of Jacob's ladder and so forth, God is going to speak to human beings through dreams, visions, and angels. Okay, so his understanding of God does not allow him to portray God talking directly to human beings. Okay, thematically, the Elohist is often going to put emphasis on the fear of God. That's going to be a major theme of this writing. Okay, the next source that Wellhausen is going to identify is going to be somebody called the priestly writer, which he calls P. Okay, P for priestly. As you can probably surmise from the name that we've given this writer, he is going to talk about a lot of things that would have been of concern to the priests. He's going to talk a lot about matters of religious practice, say, for instance, and about the proper way to approach God. For a good idea or a good understanding of P's understanding of God, again, you can simply read Genesis 1. The first story, the first creation story, is going to be written by him. And even in Genesis 1, we're already going to see several instances of things that would have been of interest to priests. For example, of course, the Sabbath day at the end of the story would have been of big interest to the priests. Even the way the priest describes the creation of the heavenly bodies would be of interest to the priest, because it talks about the sun and the moon and the stars, these lights in the heavens being created not just to give light on the earth, but also it says for times and for seasons and for days and for years. In other words, part of the reason that God created the heavenly bodies was to keep track of the calendar, which was sacred, because then it was this calendar which told the people when they were supposed to appear before God and worship. It was the priests who would have been keepers of the calendar, and so we can see why they would have been so interested in including this item in Genesis 1. Bethhausen thought that he, the priestly writer, probably wrote during the time of the exile. So classically, when I was in seminary, I learned the date of P as being around 550, somewhere during that period of time. More recently, there's been, I think, a fairly convincing move to move the P material back earlier, back into the time of the monarchy, sometime before the Exodus. And this is kind of the position that Dr. Arnold adapts in his commentary as well. So again, the dating of these things is at best a surmise, but that probably is when he was living. Like he is going to refer to God as Elohim. We said that he's going to be concerned with matters that would be of interest to the priest, particularly purity and ritual cleanness. So the entire book of Leviticus is going to be written by P, or the second part would be written probably by somebody else named H, which stands for holiness writer, which would have been incorporated into P as well. Another thing, of course, that P is going to be concerned about is law, and so we'll have a lot of that in books such as Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. The genealogies that you see probably would have been dated back to P as well. And so there are some people that suggest that P himself used these genealogies and composed the Pentateuch in its final form and integrated all these various sources into it. Other people are going to suggest that P had done his writing separately, and then yet another person later on came and integrated J and E and D with P to produce the Pentateuch. But either way, the genealogies can go back to P. As you've seen in Genesis 1, we're going to have a concern for order. And so at the bottom of the slide, I just put a question again that addresses some of the things I've been talking about. Maybe you can think about sometime or jot down what parts of Genesis 1 do you think demonstrate these themes of P as we have listed them. And finally, the fourth writer of Pentateuchal material is going to be the person we call the Deuteronomist. And as I'm sure you can guess, we call it this because this is the material that we have in Deuteronomy. So we're not going to say much about the Deuteronomist. We'll talk about these folks once we get to Deuteronomy. We can say right now that we're going to suggest it was probably sometime during the 7th century that most of this material is written. Okay, now that we have taken a look at Pentateuchal source criticism, as we call it, and by the way, source criticism is that term we use for the attempt to distinguish and identify various sources that are used in the Pentateuch. And so let's take a look at Genesis 1 to 2 itself. And as we begin to do that, I'd like to let you take a few minutes just to read through some of this again, or to skim through it because you've been reading it, and jot down some of the words, the phrases, and the ideas you see repeated in this first creation story. Okay, as you have done that, again, I'll not repeat everything that you have come up with, and I certainly will not even present the most important ones, perhaps, and probably some of the ones you have come up with are even more important than what I have here, but some of the common things that people often point to as being repeated in this story is, first of all, the structure where God says, "Let there be," and there was. God said, "Let there be," and there was. Another important part of the structure of these stories is, "And there was evening, and there was morning, the blank day." The first day, the second day, the third day, and so forth. God often will create something, and God called it so-and-so. Back in the ancient world, Giving a name to it, to something, was very important. Giving a name to somebody was very important. You were basically announcing what the essence of that thing was. A name was part of something's or someone's identity. And of course, God is going to see that it is good in the story after everything that he creates. And he's also going to put emphasis on everything bearing its own kind. The animals are able to reproduce their own kind. The plants have seeds in them, and they are able to reproduce as well. So what I'd like to do is start out just by making a few comments about each of the days of creation, day by day, as we continue throughout the chapter. You'll note that on the first day, God creates light and dark. And as he is going to do with everything that he creates, God is going to make this simply with the power of his own word. We don't have God getting his hands involved as he will in the second creation story. Rather, God will say, and whatever God says is going to come to pass. In other words, God is able to create by the power of his own word. So God will create, God is going to create light and dark. Another important word that we'll encounter is going to be the word separate. Okay, so it will tell us that God will separate the light from the darkness. Let's take a look at the second day. Beginning in verse 6, God will say, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And so God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were under the dome. And it was so, and God called the dome sky. You see that in the understanding of the writers here, what we have before this whole creative process begins is water. Everything is water, water everywhere, and not a drop to drink, as the old poem says. And water in the ancient world represented the forces of chaos. Okay, so the entire, what we would call the universe in our day and age, was just nothing but water and chaos. And so as God comes to create, what God is doing is beginning to put limits on the water, hold it back between certain boundaries, and by doing so, God is beginning to move the chaos out of the way. And so as God creates this dome called the sky, we've got a picture of it on the screen here. This is kind of their ancient understanding of what the world was like. And so God is going to create the sky, which is going to separate the waters above, okay, from the waters on the earth. And so after the second day of creation, in other words, we have the atmosphere. The dome keeps waters above the sky. That's why the sky is blue, because there are waters there. The rest of the waters are going to fill the earth. You'll see on the completed version of the earth that we have on the screen, we're also going to have the underworld, and we're also going to have these pillars of the earth. So probably they thought that there was this primordial abyss underneath the earth, and these pillars ran down through it to hold the earth steady. I think that's probably why earthquakes would have been so frightening to them, as we kind of talk about in the Psalms, because if the earth is like a dinner plate on these pillars, if it's shaking, that means the entire earth is shaking. And the last thing you would want, of course, is for it to tip over and for everybody and everything on the earth to be tipped off. Okay, so on the second day of creation, then God is going to create the heavens, which will start to move the chaotic waters either above the heavens or on the earth, and start to make it possible to create everything else. So in the third day of creation, then, God is going to create the dry land by further putting limits on where the waters can be. Okay, so now the waters on the surface of the earth do not cover the entire surface of it, but they are limited to the oceans. And then vegetation is created on this third day as well. Okay, finally, on day 4, we're going to have creation of the heavenly bodies. And as I pointed out briefly before, the heavenly bodies are significant not only because they create light and darkness, but perhaps more importantly, they establish the sacred calendar that God has instituted. Okay, finally, on day 5, we're going to have creation of the birds and the fish, which are going to occupy the sky and the water that was created on day 2. And then on day 6 will be the creation of the animals and the human beings, who occupy the dry land that was created on day 3. So we have kind of an interesting symmetrical pattern here, you will notice. Day 1, creation of light and dark, is going to correspond with day 4, the heavenly bodies that come out at day and at night. Day 2, we're going to have the sky, the dome of the sky, and then the oceans created. Day 5 are going to be the birds and the fish that live in the sky and the oceans. And then on day 3, we're going to have dry land created. And on day 6, of course, the animals and the humans that are going to live on the dry land that was created on day 3. Now, the only day that does not have another day to correspond with it, of course, is going to be day 7, the day on which God ceases his creative activity. The reason that stands alone is probably because in the mind of the writers, that day was the most important one. These priests that wrote this story wanted to draw attention above all to the day of the Sabbath. And they wanted to help their readers or their listeners understand that the Sabbath was not just an arbitrary day off, but that the institution of the Sabbath was something that God had built into the very foundations and order of the universe from the time when he had made the world. And so that kind of is going to be the apex or the climax of the story, is the creation of the Sabbath and the marking of the Sabbath on day 7. Okay, and just a couple of more comments on day 6 as well, on God's creation of human beings. One much discussed verse 26, tells us that when God created humans, he said, "Let us make humankind in our image according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth." That verse obviously has promoted a lot of discussion, but I think what I would point out to you now is that usually when you have two sentences right next to each other, put together in the fashion that they are here, there's supposed to be a close relationship between those sentences, and either they have a parallel meaning or one follows from the other. So in other words, let us make humankind in our own image, and according to our likeness is very closely related to the next part of the sentence, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea. It seems to suggest then that God, in creating human beings in his own image, has created them to have dominion over the rest of creation. Just in the same way that when an ancient king in the world, in the Near East, would create, or when he would conquer a land, rather, he would create an image of himself to place in that land, and in a way to be his image in that land and to rule over them while he is back off in his home capital. Okay, so in the same way, then, God has created human beings to rule over, to be his presence, to be his image on the earth. And the next important comment to look at would be verse 28, where God blesses the human beings, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea," and so forth. I want you to kind of file chapter 1, verse 28, "Be fruitful and multiply," file that away in your mind, because we are going to see echoes of that throughout the Old Testament as we continue. Okay, then, as we've already seen, the second creation story in Genesis 2 is quite a bit different, but I'd like to make just a few comments about it. Again, remember that we said it was written by the Yahwist, by the writer we call Jay, and a lot of the things and the characteristics of this story are fairly typical of Jay, as we're going to see it throughout the Pentateuch. Often when I have students talk about this and discuss this story, I first of all ask them to think about how Genesis 2 portrays the relationship between God and humanity, and also how it portrays the relationship between humanity and the rest of creation. So as you are looking over this material and thinking about it, I would like you to spend some time giving consideration to these questions. Just a few major themes of Genesis 2, and I'm sure you again have identified some that are more important than these, but some of the ones that stand out for me is that, first of all, in the Genesis 2 story, we're going to have the emphasis on the ground. Human beings are created out of the ground when God takes some of the earth and he forms the first human and breathes into him the breath of life, as it tells us. And so we have that close relationship. That relationship is even evident in the Hebrew vocabulary. where we have the Hebrew word Adamah, which is A-D-A-M-A-H, is going to be very closely related to the Hebrew word Adam, A-D-A-M, which of course gives us our English word Adam. Okay, so the man, the human being's name is closely related also to the word for ground, which I think is a recognition that human beings come from the ground. The other thing I like about this story is where the writer describes God's purpose in creating the man as it relates to his relationship with the ground. In verse 15, it tells us that the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and to keep it. And so the man is supposed to serve the ground, and the ground in turn serves the man. As it suggests in verse 16, the Lord commanded, "You may eat freely of every tree in the garden." Okay, so sometimes we get the impression that the Garden of Eden was just kind of like a vacation in Hawaii, where all the man and the woman did in the garden was sit around all day and sip drinks out of coconuts. Okay, but this shows that that's not the case. Life wasn't one big vacation. Right from the very beginning, God gave humankind meaningful work to do in relationship to the rest of God's creation. When we get to chapter 3, we're going to see that the difference after the humankind's act of disobedience is not now that they start working for the first time, but rather that work is going to become much more difficult. And the relationship between humans and the ground will become almost antagonistic in chapter 3, whereas in chapter 2 we could describe it as mutually beneficial. So Adam's purpose then is to work with the ground, and the ground then serves Adam as well. Third, we're going to have Adam's involvement in naming the creatures, so Adam himself is involved in the creative process. And then finally, we're going to have the story about the making of a partner told in the last part of Genesis 2. Reminds us of the social nature of human beings, that human beings are created by God to love and to be loved, and not to live in loneliness. And so it was necessary for God to create a partner for the man. Okay, so finally then, we have talked about these two creation stories, and although we've talked about them separately, largely to illustrate the difference between J and P in the form that we have them now, they of course have been put together as a piece, and so we always have to read Scripture in its context. And so really in the final analysis, let's take a look at these stories of creation kind of together as a whole. Are there any particular things that these two stories are going to say together? And I think there are. First of all, both stories together, working together, are going to reassure us that God created everything. Secondly, these two stories are going to remind us that human beings are stewards of God's creation. In the first story, they are supposed to have dominion. In the second story, Adam is working the ground. Third, both stories together tell us of the need for human community. In the first story, God creates male and female together and at the same time. And in the second story, God creates Eve for the purpose of providing a helper or a partner for Adam. The stories together also affirm the goodness of creation. The stories together describe the human ties with creation. There is some similarity between humans and the rest of creation. Humans are created as part of the creative process with the world in Genesis 1. In Genesis 2, Adam is created out of the dust of the ground itself. Also, both stories are going to talk about human closeness and ties with God. Okay, so especially in the first story, humankind is made in God's image. In the second story, humankind in the person of Adam helps God in the creative process by naming the animals. And then finally, these stories together again remind us of the dual nature of God, the dual characteristics of God's immanence and transcendence. If we had a God who was only immanent but no transcendent aspect, that would be a powerful God that wasn't really worth worshiping. On the other hand, if we had only a transcendent God with no immanence, that would be a God with whom one could not have a personal relationship. And so the immanence and the transcendence come together, beautifully combined in these two stories. Thanks for listening today. And our next lecture, which is also part of this module, will pertain to the rest of the primeval history, looking at Genesis 3 through 11.